This is the legend of a woman named Jane. Born in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, and having grown up in Calgary, Alberta, Jane found an early passion for music. In each lesson, Jane would exponentially improve and refine her performative craft. As she got older, Jane would study with legendary pianist Anton Querty in Toronto and Leon Fleischer in Baltimore. Jane was happy. And then one day, something marvelous would happen. Something that would change her life forever. At 19 years old, Jane competed at the Young Performers Competition, which was the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's national radio competition. She won first prize at that competition, and she would soon also win first prize at the Washington International Competition. This launched Jane's piano career to new heights. Jane would perform at the world's most famous concert halls, including Carnegie, Wigmore Hall, the Bolshoi Hall, the Kennedy Center, the Hong Kong Cultural Center, the Beijing Concert Hall, and Roy Thomson Hall. She would perform everything from solo concerts to ensemble concerts to orchestral concerts. Jane has also been an adjudicator for major national and international piano competitions, such as the Canadian Chopin Competition, the Honens International Competition, the Governor General's Performing Arts Awards, the New York International Piano Competition, the Glenn Gould Prize, and most fascinatingly, the Junior Van Cliburn Competition. In December 2012, Jane was appointed to the Order of Canada, and in May of 2019, she was appointed to the Order of British Columbia. Jane's performing career has spanned decades, and her recordings have even earned her 3 Juno Award nominations. Jane's legend continues to be written, and she has also helped write the legends of the next generation of pianists. Serving as an adjudicator for the Canadian Chopin Competition, Jane has also become an important checkpoint for pianists embarking on the road to Warsaw. Jane has told the stories of many composers through her musical performances, but now it is time to tell her story, her adventures, her legend. This is the legend of Jane Coop. Jane, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Amos. This is very exciting for me.
So, we first met at the 6th Canadian Chopin Competition back in January 2025. As I mentioned, you were one of the members of the jury, and I was also one of the 2 MCs slash hosts slash announcers of the Chopin competition. And at the time of recording, we are in February, so it's amazing how time just flies so quickly, but it's almost like it was just happening yesterday, honestly.
Yes, indeed. It's a very strong visual and oral memory, for sure.
Yeah. So let's start off from the very beginning. What inspired you to pursue piano?
My parents, who were not musicians, were in fact music lovers, and they had inherited a piano, an upright piano from, a great uncle. So we had a piano in the house. My parents listened to a lot of music on the radio, and they had those little 45, those little tiny vinyl records. There was a 45 changer where you had to have about 4 of them to make one movement of a symphony. They listened to those a lot, and they took us as quite small children, like 7 or 8 years old, to symphony concerts. So there was no real push for me and my sister, who was also a pianist, to become musicians by any means, not at all. But they thought, well, we'd like to give our daughters music lessons, and so they did that. And I just, both of us really took to it. We had a household that had a lot of music in it, and it was just there. It was part of our life.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well. In the instance that actually my mom was my first piano teacher, actually. So yeah, plenty of music in the house, and also hearing my mom's other piano students also learning in the house as well. Even to this day, honestly. So whenever I come by, I always hear it. So it's always good to hear.
Yes, yes, yes. It's just part of your it's just part of your life. Your,
Exactly.
yeah.
With that, with the background that you had, there would have been many influences on your musical style, at least I would assume. What were those influences?
Well, my my first piano teacher was Alexandra Munn, who was a student, a pupil of one of Canada's really most well-known teachers, Gladys Egbert, who both of these people were in Calgary. Sandra had just returned from Juilliard, from being a student at Juilliard. So she was, she was young, she was energetic, and she was really knowledgeable. And I absolutely adored her. So she gave me lots of Bartok, lots of Borkowitz, pieces that just slightly outside the normal, but which I loved a lot. And she was incredibly encouraging. I just remember her, she called me Flash. And I just remember the lessons and the whole experience as being a wonderful one of my young childhood. When she moved away to Edmonton, I then went to her teacher, Gladys Egbert, who was a very different person, very, very meticulous. She'd been a student of Ernest Hutchinson in New York, who I think studied with, I think was a student of Liszt at one time. Anyway, it was a big, big lineage. I come from a good lineage. And she was very, very demanding and very encouraging, but in a much more restrained way. She never really said, "Oh, that sounds really wonderful, Jane." She just said, "Well, that's all right, but listen to this and think about this." And she got me really thinking and got me to really practice for details. And then after that, I went to Toronto and studied with Anton Querty, who, again, completely different kind of teacher, who wanted me to be independent. He wanted me to write cadenzas for Mozart concerti. He never wanted to hear anything more than twice, ever. You had to play it once, you could use the music. The second time, you had to have it from memory, and that was it. Sometimes I had to beg him for a third lesson, for instance, right before I was in the CBC competition. I said, "Please, could you hear my concerto one more time?" And he did. Also a fantastic mind, really, really a huge inspiration. After that was Leon Fleischer, who had this fantastic sort of generous approach to the piano, warm, sort of compelling approach that just made you just want to express yourself as much and as distinctly as possible. So I feel as if I had luck all the way along the line.
Yeah, that and for those who are not familiar with these teachers, in particular Leon Fleischer, if I recall correctly, I think he was also the teacher of Daniel Vnukovsky, who's one of the hosts of Classical 96.3 FM here in Toronto, and Classical FM as well. I think I remember hearing a few days ago, Daniel Vnukovsky hosts the 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. weekday shows, the Classical Jukebox, and I think on one of the requests, it was a performance, it was a recording by Leon Fleischer, and I think if I recall correctly, he said, "Yeah, great to hear one of my old profs." So I was like, "Oh, okay, well."
Yeah, no, he I don't know if I'd refer to him as my old prof. I would refer to him as a shining light in my life.
So, speaking about the CBC National Radio Competition, take us back to that time. You were 19 at the time, and you won first prize. What was it like?
Well, pretty exciting. I had been in it 2 years before that, I think. Yes, when I was 17, and I was a semifinalist that year, and I played Rachmaninoff's First Concerto. And this time around, then I was still in Calgary. So this time around, I was already in Toronto and studying with Anton Querti. And I chose to play Prokofiev's Second Concerto, which is a monster piece. And I worked like crazy on that piece. I just worked like crazy. I didn't really know what was going to happen. I know that the two piano finalists were me and quite a good friend of mine, Camille Inkman from Victoria. And I think she had got, I don't know, second prize the year before or something. Anyway, it was all very, very exciting. And I remember being up there and playing that concerto and just thinking, well, I'm ready for this. I prepared well enough, and I'm excited, and I'm going to do it. And it happened.
It certainly did. It certainly did. And as I mentioned in my introduction, that would spring your career into new heights, into new levels, and you would perform at so many of the most world-renowned halls around the world, including Carnegie, Wigmore, and Bolshoi. What was it like to perform at these halls?
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. I mean, I would say Wigmore Hall and the Bolshoi Hall in St. Petersburg, which is the hall that Horowitz played in, were the highlights in terms of halls, because both of them had incredible acoustic, fabulous piano, great audience. I mean, in St. Petersburg, the audience, there were 2,000 people in the hall to hear me. I mean, who knew? And they were so quiet and so attentive. I think in Russia at the time, audiences didn't go so much to the star system. It was the music they were after, really. And they knew the music in my program. You could really tell. So, those places were magic for me, really. I'll never forget those places. I mean, lots of other places too have been memorable, but those, as far as the actual hall and the pianos, were the best.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned about how not just the sheer number of of patrons coming out to watch you, over 2,000 people, but the fact that they're more focused on the music than the celebrity part of it.
Yes, yes.
I think that this is very true of also parts of Europe as well. I mean, with the International Chopin Competition, I think that's goes without saying that I would say most of the public there, most of the Polish public there would be focused more on, because you're essentially hearing almost the same pieces played over and over again.
Over and over, yes.
So you're thinking, okay, which one's the best one and the most Chopin-esque, for lack of a better phrase to simplify for our audience, like, which one is the best subjectively in terms of that, which is very different from Canada and the US, where they're basing it. Well, I shouldn't say that this is actually not classical music I'm talking about. It's more like pop music or that sort of thing, where they're just going there to see, like Taylor Swift, for example, just had a major tour in North America, and people are there just to see her, but not necessarily look at the music itself, right? It's a whole different kind of system. But even ignoring the super celebrities like Taylor Swift, just in general, the kind of
never heard of her. Never heard of her. Sorry.
It's in general, in North America, it's just a different sort of perspective. It's the celebrity over the deeper aspects, which is unfortunate in many ways.
Yeah, I don't know whether you can actually say it's over the deeper musicality. I wouldn't say that's true, but there are a lot of people who don't get a performing career who really deserve it. Put it that way. It is definitely the star system, but many of the stars are fantastic as well. So it's not one or the other, but for sure there are the non-competition winners hardly ever get anywhere in this environment.
Yeah, and especially with classical music, with Europe having more, it was essentially the birthplace of Western classical music, you would, of course, know and see that there's a pedigree and a history that goes behind the cultural aspects of how important it is to those specific countries.
Yeah.
Versus Canada in particular, which is still a very young country overall and does not have as much of a history with classical music compared to Germany, Austria,
Right.
Poland,
Right.
or Russia, or any of the Eastern European states, or Britain or France for that matter. That's why it's very difficult to sort of relate this music to the especially the younger audiences, but even to somewhere into the Gen X audiences, it's still quite difficult at times to do so, and it affects also opportunities to perform.
Yes, I was thinking, as you speaking of Europe, especially East Europe, I've played quite a lot in East Europe, in Poland and Hungary and Estonia, and that is true. There seems to be a really deep love of the music, whoever it is playing it. But I also feel that's true in the smaller places in Canada, because I've played in many small communities, and these people generally are not so invested in having a famous person. I mean, they would like to know about that person who's playing, but they don't have to have the sort of most expensive, most New York agent person. And I've found a similar approach in these places, in some of these small places. So thank goodness for that.
Yeah, and times are changing. I think, especially having seen the Canadian Chopin Competition, I think the attention both online and in person has, at least from what I've seen, in my own opinion of it, I think it's getting better in the sense that I know that a number of my friends who are either not musically trained or have had some musical training, but never actually went down a performing route or anywhere into a full-on music career of any kind. I know that when they came to watch, it's like, wow, I had no idea I could actually get this intense. I'm like, yeah. And here's the best part. Especially with the Chopin competition, you hear the same pieces, you never get sick of it because every pianist plays it differently. And even the pianist, if they play on two separate days, it may sound just a little different too, even. So no two performances are different. And they're just like, yeah, I'm so mesmerized by it. So
well, that is one of the wonderful things. I mean, no matter how many times one listens, young people tend to really listen a lot on YouTube to other performers, both famous and older and all sorts of things. But no matter if they copy them as best they can, they still are going to sound different. So that's good. That's
exactly.
a good thing.
Exactly. And speaking about competitions, as I also mentioned earlier, you serve as a member of the jury for many top competitions. So stepping on both sides of the competition as a former competitor and now as a jury member, especially when it comes to Honens, the Cliburn, and the Canadian Chopin Competition, what are the similarities and differences in your perspectives being a competitor versus being the jury member?
Well, being a jury member is not easy. It's not easy at all because the level of playing now these days is so high for every competition that I've judged lately. I mean, it's just phenomenal, really. I come away from these competitions feeling very humbled. And so personally, as a jury member, I want to be told a story with the music, and B, I want to hear this person again. That person has something to say that moves me, that's unique, that touches me. And I mean, because so many of the young people can play anything these days. I mean, just think about the Chopin competition, the junior division of the Chopin competition. I mean, technique is nothing anymore. It's just, never mind technique. It's phenomenal. So I'm really looking for a personal approach, a certain intelligence, a certain understanding of the style and sophistication, way beyond the technical acumen. When I was competing, it's not an easy thing to do, to just get up and play in these high pressured competitions. Not easy at all. I never found it particularly wonderful to do, even though I did well in some of them. I just found it a big stress from A to Z. And I'm sure that most people do find that. The good thing about it is it makes you prepare as if your life depended on it. And that's a good thing. So, but I don't know. The whole idea of competitions in art is a difficult one. It's a difficult one.
Yeah. And I mean, Horowitz has gone on record saying his own opinions about competitions as well. So, and talking about preparing for competitions, I mean, when I was younger, and this was over a decade ago, I actually competed at the Canadian Music Competition. So I totally get how it's so, I mean, the amount of practice first and foremost is going to be, well, you need that amount, right? And the quality and the quantity in spades, basically. And number two, especially at that age, I was 15, 16 at the time preparing for it. You had that along with school, and I was doing the IB program back in the day. So I'm just like, oh man, I mean, you're in school from 9 to 3:30, or at the time it was actually 8:30 to 3, I should say. And then you're back home, you get a snack, you eat something quickly, and then you practice, and then you also have to do homework. It's like, I barely get enough sleep and that kind of thing, right? So
right. But Amos, I mean, I was in doing some master classes in Shanghai a few years ago, and a man was driving me around back and forth to the conservatory, and very nice man. He had a son who was 9 years old, who was just getting ready to audition for the middle school in Shanghai, which is, one of the big schools. And he said his son was practicing 6 hours a day. Yep. 6 hours a day. I said, how is that possible? Well, an hour before school, come back, do 2 more hours right after school, then do homework, then eat, then do 3 more. I can't remember, but it was some unbelievable thing. And another thing is that when I was judging the Cliburn juniors, they're given access to a piano while they're in the competition. They're given 6 hours a day access to a piano, and some of them were complaining that wasn't enough. And these are people who have already prepared at that level. I don't know.
Oh my!
It's beyond me.
Oh man! And so back in the day when I was practicing around 5 hours, 6 hours. But on really busy days, I would have to hit like 3 or 4 hours. But I mean, that was on top of all the other responsibilities. But I'm hearing these kids, like, what? That's insane.
And I saw on some of the applications, some of them were chess masters, some of them were competitive swimmers. I mean, I just don't get it. It's a whole different era.
I can only imagine what kids, the pressure they have to go through now.
Yes.
It's intense, and I do not envy them at all.
Oh, I do not envy them at all either. But I'm always amazed to see how well they handle the piano at such a young age. It's beyond me. I mean, there's no way I was playing like that at 14.
Yeah.
I think I had a good sense of what music was all about. And I loved it, but my fingers were not like that.
Yeah. And going back to when you mentioned about how it's a very difficult job, I mean, the Chopin competition, I've seen it with my own eyes. Especially the final rounds. Oh my goodness, you had to decide between Ryan Wang, Athena Deng, Eric Guo, Alex Yang, Jerry Hu. Right. And I'm just like, how on earth do you pick? I mean, I sort of had an idea as to who would probably be up there and who will get an honorable mention, but I'm like, who gets first, second, and third?
I know. It's very hard. I mean, in that case, you couldn't discount their other rounds.
Yeah.
You could not. Mm-hmm. So, you do have more than just the concerto to base your judgment on. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
But also, there's a strange thing about that competition is that everybody, I think this is a new requirement, that everybody plays the Polonaise-Fantasie in the final. I think that's true in Warsaw now, too.
That's new.
which is, I find a very odd, very, very odd thing. That's a very difficult piece musically. And I, I don't know. I mean, in a way, I think it reveals more than the concerto does.
Yeah, and that's why I agree with that. Though I do see where the Chopin Institute was coming from in Warsaw. I do see where the Fryderyk Chopin Institute in Warsaw was coming from because as you mentioned, it's such a difficult piece musically, and since it expresses or says a lot more than even the concerto does. Think of it hypothetically. The competition in Warsaw, the international competition, is already 4 rounds, and that's the main competition I'm talking about. So let's suppose that we gave the Polonaise in the Polonaise-Fantasie in A flat major its own round. That would be 5 rounds, right? That would be a grueling thing. And then let's say we put it before the concerto, as in like round 4 is the Polonaise, and then round 5 is the concerto. I mean, it's a bit tough for the competitors, I would assume, because that's another round to then account for when you're already later into the rounds, right? But then it's like if you put it in the finals, which is what they're doing right now, one of the issues is, I mean, even the best pianists are going to have some stamina issues by that point in the competition, because you've got like they've already been competing for 3.5 weeks at that point. But but I do see where they're coming from. I do see where they're coming from because it's so musically challenging, and I think I see it. I see it.
Well, it's an interesting idea because, as I say, I do think it reveals more than the concerto. But it's such a different thing to play a big solo piece like that, demanding solo piece, and then a concerto right after that. I think it's asking a lot. If it were me, I would have put that piece, maybe a required piece, but in a previous round.
Yeah, and it was. It was at the previous edition in 2021. I think, yeah. So, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's, it is what it is.
It is what, yeah.
And if anything is, I at least from a spectator's perspective, it should be very interesting to see, and probably entertaining to see as well, to see who could really.
Well, yes, that piece really indicated a lot in the Canadian Chopin competition. A lot more than the concerto.
And even myself, myself having been, being there in person and also rewatching it, I heard a lot of different parts about it that it's so nuanced. But it's the nuance that gives the beauty of it. That's so profound.
Well, it's also quite a demanding piece in terms of the big picture. To fit all these little things into a big picture, not just one little event after the other. So you have to have in your mind, an enormous sense of the piece as a whole, and then as you travel through it, you have to know what each kind of section is going to say and contribute to the whole. It's not a piece for two very young people, I don't think.
Yeah.
But there you go.
Yeah, totally agree.
Personal opinion.
Totally agree. Although, Ryan was 17. Is still 17, so
I know. Amazing.
Yeah, and all of this requires a mature sense of musicality. As we move into a more detailed discussion about the road to Warsaw, musicality, and especially Chopin, I think we should start off with this time-tested question. What is musicality to you?
Oof, that's a big question. Well, musicality is made up of a lot of different aspects. It's about, as I say, telling a story. And you can't just play the music without having in your mind a very strong sense of what this music is saying. Now, I don't mean a story in terms of, a story that you could actually articulate, but a story of imagination. And that imagination has to tell you about sound, about pacing, about breathing, about nuance. You don't want every little bar to be nuanced. Otherwise, the thing falls apart. but you need a very delicate, especially in Chopin, very delicate sense of nuance. Also, remember that Chopin himself did not play with a triple forte sound ever, ever. And that's something that I think young people don't quite get yet. I mean, it's not about playing as loudly as you can in, say, one of the Polonaises or even in the concertos. It's about the kind of sound, and the sound on the piano can be very, very different from piano to piano, from person to person. So musicality is something that communicates to the audience, communicates something that's not verbal. It can't be verbal, but it makes that listener feel something. If you don't feel anything when you're listening, if you're not inspired to sort of have a sense of emotional reaction, then there's no point. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, that's a great answer to the question. No, that's a very, very good one. And I'm glad you mentioned how, especially with Chopin, he never really had a fortissimo or fortissimo sound truly. I mean, even the pianos back then, the Pleyel pianos, they're not designed, their sound does not carry across in the same way that a modern grand, especially a modern concert grand, would carry across.
Right.
So the approach to it, and that's why I think even the International Chopin Competition on period instruments is such a great addition, because you really get as close to accurate as possible the sound of what it would have sounded like back in the 1800s and maybe even early 1900s too. So, and again, this all comes down to maturity. And no matter what, no matter how talented a kid is, they're still a kid, right? And it's very rare that you see kids actually perform with the maturity of a 20-something, 30-something, or a fully grown adult, right?
Yeah,
that takes time, and that takes a lot of, that takes a good teacher as well.
Yes, and a lot of experience and a lot of thought, a lot of sort of philosophy, you know. Okay, playing Chopin on period instruments is also, as you say, it's very interesting, very informative kind of thing. But because we have access to those kind of performances now, it always surprises me when young people get up and play, you know, with a huge Steinway sound, which, you know, it's not that we have to match Chopin's sound. We don't have to do that because we're using modern instruments, just like we don't have to do that with Bach. But we're not playing Tchaikovsky, right, or Prokofiev. It's not about that muscular kind of sound.
Yeah,
much more elegant and sophisticated.
Yeah, totally agree. And about Chopin himself, who is he to you?
I feel as if he was a person who had a lot going on inside, but was quite a restrained person. He didn't wear his heart on his sleeve at all. And that's also, I think, something we need to keep in mind for his music. It's not about explosive, out there feeling. He himself had this, as I say, a sort of a restrained, kind of shy personality. And you can't say that wouldn't be translatable into his music. I think that has to be part of it. And so when I'm playing Chopin, I think about that. I mean, I don't think, oh well, I better, you know, keep things back and restrain myself. But I do think, now, what kind of a sound is going to give the impression that I want without going overboard? What is going to be give as I say, an elegance to the playing, and a warmth. I mean, there's just nothing like Chopin for melodies and expressivity. There's just nothing like it. I mean, pianists are so lucky to have this composer at their fingertips, as it were.
Yeah. Chopin was an introvert.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Definitely.
So he very much did not prefer the large, very noisy kinds of settings. He preferred much more. I mean, he even performed in very small, intimate settings as well.
That's right. He was no Liszt, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's also why his music is so profound to people around the world and to the average person. It's that he has a lot to say, but he doesn't say it out as like just throw it out there. I mean, at least like he's not like yelling it. He's not yelling or screaming at the top of his voice musically. He's
Right.
profound about it. He's talking. He's reserved, but not really fully reserved.
Yeah,
He's not,
reserved. I think reserved is a good word, because it doesn't mean that it's not expressive at all,
yeah.
as you have to say.
He-
I think I think that his way of writing music is very touching. I think one of the most appealing things about Chopin are the melodies he wrote, which are just unbelievable, unbelievable.
yeah.
And people respond to melody.
Yeah. And it's such a tragedy that he died at such an early age, 39 years old, I believe.
Yeah,
So
39.
truly,
39.
truly a tragedy there. But his music is essentially immortalized for, well, the rest of time. So at that, I mean, I don't want to say at the very least because it diminishes it, but like this like it's not the least that he could do. It's like basically like his magnum opus was his entire career in life and his contributions to the musical world. And that's why I think the International Chopin Competition is so revered. And even the Van Cliburn competition as well. I mean, for those in our audience who are not familiar with these competitions, think of the International Chopin Competition as Wimbledon or the Olympics and Van Cliburn as the U.S. Open, basically, right? Two of the two Grand Slams, basically, if you think of it that way. I think that's why it gives it that allure because it's not just the most talented people that's going up there, but especially in Chopin's case, we're only looking at Chopin's music, and I think Chopin in many ways embodies the complete pianist.
Yeah, yeah, in some ways, yes, I think so. I mean, certainly the Chopin competition is unique because it's only one composer. No other competitions like that. But I mean, when you think about the Queen Elizabeth competition, which was one of the very first competitions, the Tchaikovsky competition, Honens, Bachauer, Capel. I mean, there are competitions coming out of the woodwork now, and they're all hugely high standards. They have big juries. They have big prize money now. So, I mean, what sets the Chopin competition apart is A, its singular composer, and B, the familiarity that all the audiences, whether they're streaming or being in person, or the pianists, everybody knows these works. They know these works. There's nobody can play something nobody's heard.
Yeah.
Which is not true of any of the other competitions.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's very, very interesting. I mean, I frankly can't imagine being on the Chopin jury of the Warsaw competition because I don't know how long it is. It's like 3 weeks or something.
Like a
Is it?
month.
A month of hearing Chopin every day, all day. Oh,
It's all of October.
oh, yikes.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
I do not envy Shustov.
Right.
Yeah. And Krzysztof Jabłoński, for those of you who are not familiar, that's the person I'm referring to, a legendary Polish pianist who was also the chair of the jury for the Canadian Chopin Competition and will also be at the International Chopin Competition this year. Yeah, he's got a very, very tough job ahead of him in October.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
yeah.
I don't know whether I could keep my focus well enough over that much time and that much Chopin. I don't know. It would be hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm assuming this year will be similar to the one in 2021 in the sense that there will be multiple different pianos that are going to be present. In the last edition, there were 2 Steinways, 1 Yamaha, 1 Kawai, and 1 Fazioli. And I bring this up because specifically for the Steinways, and I've heard this from talking with other pianists here in Canada, they mention how there's a slight difference between the New York Steinways and the Hamburg Steinways. And I've only performed on New York Steinways. I've never had a chance to perform on a Hamburg Steinway. So I don't know where the difference lies, but I'm not sure if you've had that experience ever.
I have a Hamburg Steinway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes, no, I have performed on both of those. They are different, but even different as they are, each Steinway is different from each other one. So,
Yeah.
You may get a Hamburg Steinway that has a particularly pointed sound, bell-like sound. You get another one which has a very warm, compelling sound. You just have to try whatever they give you and do your best.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how much time the pianists get on each piano, but if they don't get more than, if they don't get an hour to try 5 pianos, that's awful.
Well,
but I bet they don't.
The last edition, they had 15 minutes.
Yeah, how can you know? So there you go. That's these days. That's life.
Yeah, totally
and I don't think in the Canadian Chopin Competition, I don't think anybody got to try the piano before they played. I think that's true.
Sorry, was it the Canadian Chopin or the International? Oh, Canadian Chopin. Yeah, I think it was just the one.
Yeah, but nobody got to try it.
Yeah.
Before they played, which is that's asking a lot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I think, and Athena mentioned this to me on an earlier episode of this miniseries, The Road to Warsaw. I think in her approach was that she wasn't really focusing on necessarily the nuances of the piano, as more on her own performance and having the right mindset going into it.
Yeah,
and I think even for the International Chopin Competition, you have the advantage of having those 15 minutes, even though it's 15 minutes. But at the end of the day, I think your performance is the one that really carries across, right? Like at that point,
Yeah, if I were running any of those competitions, I frankly would just want to have one piano because, when you're going on the road and you're going to usually you only have one piano. Usually you don't have a couple. Sometimes you do, but often there's only one piano, and that's it. That's your instrument. So in a way, I think it could reveal a lot to have just that one piano, which hopefully would be a wonderful instrument, and see what everybody does with it.
Yeah, and hopefully that won't snap, right?
Right.
That's what happened to Horowitz in Carnegie at one point. Played Rachmaninoff's Piano Sonata No. 2, and then he snapped the low E.
Oh, that made a great sound.
My goodness. Yeah. Now, returning back to Chopin, in what ways has he surprised you from a musical perspective, biographical perspective, and historical perspective? So in what ways, in studying Chopin, what has surprised you about him?
All right. Well, I would say the thing that surprised me most was how contrapuntal his music is. How contrapuntal it is. I mean, you think of Chopin and you think of his tunes, wonderful, wonderful melodies that are so prevalent in all the works for piano. But what you don't really know until you really get into these is all the layers of all the voices that come underneath the melody and provide a depth of sound and also a depth of color and really activity too, because sometimes the melody will be a very, very sort of gentle, broad melody, and underneath you'll have a more nervous kind of underpinning sometimes. Sometimes that's not true. All the nocturnes have a certain basic pattern for the left hand, which has quite a big leap, and then a few notes up toward the middle of the piano, and then down to a bass note. And that has to be done with ease. You can't just be thinking, oh, a bass note. Oh no, I have to come up here. No, I have to go down there again. That has to be done with absolute ease, because the right hand is going to be on its own plane of physicality. So I have to say that the most surprising thing for me is this idea of what's happening outside the melodies.
Right. Right, yeah. And to understand that and to express that in a good way and to also embody what's also outside of the melodies, you have to practice it. I mean, there's no other way around it. As a pianist, you have to practice piano as a whole. I
That's
know
true. That's true.
I know all the kids, if there are any kids who are listening to this, it's like, oh, it's like, yeah, well, I mean, you can't take shortcuts here. It's so,
Right. And also one other thing, Amos, that I think is a bit surprising is um, the indications that Chopin does for articulation, which some people just ignore completely because, well, I've got the main melody, I've got everything else, I've got the sound, but the articulation, which means, the separation of phrases, the joining of these notes and the separation of that note, and sometimes the pedaling. Sometimes the pedaling is very odd in Chopin, but oftentimes it indicates really quite a lot of what he wanted.
yeah. And this is fascinating because when there was a Chopin talk that we had at the Canadian Chopin Competition, Dr. Adam Zukevich, a professor who specializes in researching the history of Chopin's compositions and music and performance, he gave a talk on the issue of what was Chopin's original manuscripts and intentions. Because, and I'm citing him and I'm quoting him, or I should say, I'm paraphrasing what he was saying. There wasn't really an Urtext for
Right.
Chopin.
Right.
So the persistent question essentially becomes, to what extent can we go as close as possible to what Chopin's original unedited, unintervened, if that's even a word, manuscripts are or intentions are in terms of the actual performances? Because pretty much almost everything that we have right now has been at least maybe a first, maybe a second or third edition.
Yeah, edited. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
so that's where it's really fascinating in that regard because, and I think you even mentioned that there are also, for those that are original manuscripts, there's multiple versions, there's multiple original manuscripts
Right.
of the same piece. So it's like,
That Chopin wrote over and over again. Yes, yes,
yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
So
I know that's it. That is really kind of upsetting for those of us who would like to figure out. I mean, a tiny detail, like for instance, there are a couple of notes in some of the music that I'm convinced are wrong in Paderewski, Ekier, all the editions that we have available. It's wrong, that note. I know it's wrong. I can't ask him because he's not around. But these little things make for fun conversations between pianists. Um,
yeah,
but in the end, because of that, because we don't have the Bible of Chopin, um, we just have to make choices of 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 these editions. And I wondered for a while whether the big Warsaw competition would only accept the Ekier or Ekier edition, but that's not true. They're happy with the Paderewski, and I have an edition of Chopin that was edited by Jane Sterling, who was a pupil of Chopin in Scotland, and that's interesting too. Very, very unedited, very clear, nice copy. I like it.
yeah, yeah. And like you said, there's very fascinating conversations between pianists on how things should be or should at least be in the vicinity of being. And that's, I think, also the beauty of it because, and I'm also glad that the Warsaw International Chopin Competition doesn't actually say this is the edition,
Right.
because in doing so, you've already bottlenecked so many interpretations that could come out of other editions as well, that could have something to say or something even better to say than the one edition or the one or two editions that you picked as a
Absolutely.
competition.
Absolutely. No, I agree with that. And in a way, it gives you a little bit more freedom because there isn't, only that.
Exactly. Exactly. Now, returning back to the issue of practice, how do you master the quality and the quantity of practice, especially in a world that's so busy? And never mind all the additions for a moment. Regardless of what additions you're using, you have to actually practice your ability to perform it. But in today's very busy age, how do you master the quality and quantity of practice?
Well, I mean, I've had a very busy life all my adult life. I mean, I had a big job at the University of British Columbia, a big teaching job. I was head of piano for a number of years, and that required, a lot of my time and energy. In the meantime, I was playing a lot of concerts. So my practice time had to be so efficient, so efficient. I couldn't just sit around and think, oh, well, I'll do this for a while and then I'll do that. Or I'll go over this particular part 25,000 times and hope that it gets better. Can't do that. Have to practice with a sense of what is the best way of getting around this particular event musically. What's the best fingering? I find this sort of thing fascinating. Fingering is fascinating. Fingering can make all the difference. And I've also learned a lot, of course, from teaching my own students, because I have to find a way for them to get into the music and around certain technical aspects of it. But the efficiency means you have to decide what you're going to practice at any one. Say I've got a 2-hour time frame here that I have to do something in. I have to decide what I'm going to do in that 2 hours. I have to decide what I hope to accomplish in that 2 hours. And I have to just go at it with the most efficient, it's a word I have to use because that's the way I've thought about it, way of getting the right sound, of getting the right legato, of getting the right phrasing, even if it's just a small portion, one page. Then I come away from it thinking, yes, I think I got into that in the way I wanted. But you can't waste time. You just can't. And lots of practicing can be a waste of time if you just go over things and over things. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, a lot of technical acumen comes from the brain. Not from just more finger stuff.
I mean, as the Royal Conservatory of Music says, the finest instrument is the mind. It's in their branding, but it makes total sense, right?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does make total sense. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I remember when I was practicing for concerts and for competitions, I realized that there are also moments where if I practice that one area too much, I actually start getting worse to that area. It's like,
sure.
Oh, you're kidding me, right? I mean,
oh yeah, that happens too. I mean, you think you've got something. Oh yeah, I got that today, and you go back to it the next day, and it's worse. Yes, that's true. That's
true.
I
just think, I got to step away from this for at least a day or two. It's like, this is horrible.
I also talk to myself when I practice.
Oh Same here.
Just to in a way, I'm my own teacher. I'd say, well, what are you doing there? That doesn't make any sense to do that fingering or that phrasing.
Yeah.
At least it's company.
Yeah. For me, when I was younger, it was not just my own voice, it's my mom's voice too.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I never had that.
Yeah. It's like, no, you're doing this wrong. I was like, oh, Mom, seriously?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, Jonathan Crow, the concertmaster of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, I had him on an earlier episode of my podcast. He actually started out by, when I asked him this question about practice, he actually answered, yeah, ask me in 25 years and I think I have a better answer for you. And
that's probably true.
Yeah. And I mean, he was telling me about his experience on that episode where there were times where he would actually be practicing at the airport, waiting for the flight to begin, waiting to board the flight. And like you said, it had to be really efficient. And especially, I mean, his kids are pretty much grown up now, but when they were young, I mean, you got to take care of your children. That's also another huge responsibility you have to do on top of being concertmaster, being a performing violinist, and doing all these very big projects as well. Yeah, the efficiency part, I think, is what most.
Yeah, well, yeah, I have a family also. I mean, I have a daughter, and I was going to say one other thing, Amos, and that is that a lot of practicing, especially as you get closer to a performance, is done in just silently in your head, imagining the piece. A lot of good work is done that way. And if you can't go through a piece in your mind without being at the piano, then you really don't know it.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation about essentially having to be a bit philosophical or substantially philosophical about the music. When it comes to the performance of a piece of music, and especially for Chopin's pieces, to what extent do you use the composer's written philosophy, whether it's in the music itself or in their letters or in their academic works, if they had any? How much do you use that written philosophy in your performance, and to what extent do you incorporate your own philosophy?
Right. Well, I have to say I don't take the composer's life to be too strong an influence on my own interpretation of the music, except in the case of Chopin, where we already spoke that he was an introvert, a private person, not flamboyant at all, and I do keep that in my mind when I'm thinking about the interpretation. But I mean, my own philosophy about music and how it should be it's developed over many, many years, and I don't really listen to too many pianists. In fact, I if I'm going to a concert, I much prefer to go to a string quartet concert or an orchestra concert than a piano recital. Because, I mean, I'm at the stage now where I've thought about a lot of music, and I feel as if the way I want to play it is the way I want to play it, no matter what, whether anyone else agrees with that or not. So in a way, my philosophy is I have to find it from myself, from my inner self, than someone else's, if that makes any sense.
That is very interesting, because I think that's also, again, it's also a reflection of the experience. And I mean this in the best way, also a reflection of age as well.
Mm-hmm,
because
sure.
For all of the young performers that I've met personally and in other ways as well, whether if it's in their 20s, 30s, 40s, you know, with these musicians, they all still tell me about who they're inspired by, right?
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
Martha
Yeah.
Argerich or Vladimir Horowitz, or
Yeah.
if you're in the violin world, Yehudi Menuhin. But
Right.
I have yet to hear a single musician, or a young musician, I should say, who says, "Oh, this is what you said," as in, "I'm playing it the way I want to play it."
Yeah. Oh, well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, certainly when I was younger, lots of pianists inspired me. I mean, I would say in recent years, and I'm not even talking about that recent, but in the last 10 years, I mean, two pianists who are on the scene today have really, really moved me a lot. One of them is Grigory Sokolov, and the other is Richard Good. And I'm such a fan of those, and they're both sort of similar in a way. They're both very thoughtful, very unflamboyant pianists, and they're playing just. I mean, it does something to me, and so I'm still inspired by that sort of thing. And I would go to hear those two people for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, you still have your taste, and eventually, you of course want to, indulge in it, in once in a while, not as a performer, but as as a listener, as an audience
Mm-hmm.
member.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's always good to have that side of yourself as well. And you mentioned about the development of your music style for so many years, as you mentioned, for so many years of performing and thinking. How has your style evolved over the decades, and how have you been able to develop that evolution of that performing style?
Well, I think my performing style has actually evolved quite a bit over the years. I wouldn't say that I've actually made it evolve, that I've, proactively decided to change my style or to. It's just happened because of more experience in playing a lot of repertoire. But also one of the things that's really changed me is playing. Well, I had 10 years of playing all the Beethoven sonatas for violin and piano with Andrew Dawes, who was one of Canada's great violinists. And just to be that involved with playing with a violin, which can do so much more than a piano in terms of everything, color, intervals, everything, articulation, bow, everything. I've learned a lot from that. And even though that has nothing to do with Chopin, it has definitely influenced me in how I play everything, really. I'm practicing the Ravel G major concerto right now, which I have to play next month. And I would say the last time I played that was good 15 years ago. And as I come back to it now, I'm pretty sure I play it differently, but I can't really tell you that I'm overtly playing it differently. It just is.
Yeah. And that's the thing with music in general. You can't really say that you're doing something. It's you perform it. It just shows, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's show don't tell, and that sort of situation.
Show don't tell. Yes.
Yeah, and in mentioning your concertos, how do you coordinate the best possible strategy with concerti, or like in terms of how do you cooperate with whatever group performance, I should say, that you have in terms of the strategy? What's the best way that you do it?
Well, the best thing I can think of is that you really have to know the whole score really well. You really have to know what's happening in the orchestra while you're playing, so that it's never a surprise. And I like to sort of think of concertos slightly on the chamber music side. If I'm playing a section of a concerto that has to go along with the clarinet, I want to engage with that player and make sure that we are on the same page and that we're respecting each other and understanding each other. And if I'm supposed to come in with the first violinist, I'm always attuned to the concertmaster. And so you always want to be part of the group rather than, unfortunately, with the way things are set up, the piano is way out in the front, and the conductor is almost behind the piano, and then there's the orchestra over there. And I like it to be as close as possible, and I like to feel as if I can communicate with any one of the members of the orchestra, certainly all the winds and the principal strings. And I have to know what's going to go on.
Yeah.
Because we don't get a lot of rehearsal. Usually you just get one good rehearsal and a dress rehearsal, which is not very much.
Yeah. That's like you mentioned, it's so important to have that awareness of mind with whoever you're performing with. The worst thing that can happen is, well, you're all playing completely disjointed, and it's like, where on earth are you at, or what are you doing? This is completely off, that sort of thing. And
well,
and that's the thing that I'm also fascinated by, especially with the Canadian Chopin Competition, the senior division, when they had only one rehearsal session with the quartet, because we didn't have an orchestra for the Canadian Chopin Competition.
Right.
We had a quartet. Because it's so, with that one chance, you have to, well, first of all, you've never known them before. So it's like literally, hi, my name's so-and-so, nice to meet you, that sort of thing. And then afterwards, okay, let's go straight into it. Then you had to develop that chemistry. It's like, wow, okay, well, you got one day to do it. And then the next day, you're right up there on the stage. It's like,
right. And then with the Chopin concertos, unlike most other concertos, there is so much flexibility in the piano part, and it's pretty hard to follow. So for those particular concertos, I think the best thing one can do with one's quartet or orchestra partners is to say, my left hand is going to indicate almost everything you need to hear. So really concentrate on my left hand, because the right hand, could be floating around up there. And you can't be expected to know where I'm going to come back down to the main note again. Just listen to the left hand. And that's a pretty good way of getting around it, because those concertos are hard.
Yeah.
Difficult for the orchestra, difficult for the conductor. Of course, the conductor in the Warsaw gets to do, 49 E minor concertos in a row. So they know it pretty well.
Yeah. and that's, I'm so glad you mentioned about the left hand versus the right hand, especially with Chopin's music. Thinking back to the finals, thinking back to those performances, and especially with Ryan's performance, I want to go to his second movement, because this is a piece that I've heard hundreds of times. You've probably heard it thousands of times. When at one point I was actually trying to prepare for the Canadian Chopin competition over a decade ago, but I turned it down because of school, right? But if I went, this would have been my finals piece. So this was also a piece that I practiced religiously back in the day as well. And I hear his performance. And for the first time, I've heard many of these performances, like I said, hundreds of times. I actually shed a tear. Like it moved me in such a profound way, at least from my own approach to it. He hit every single thing I was looking for, and he had even more. And I think it has to do, one part of it, it's not the only part, but one part of it is the left hand and the right hand, and how he's able to compare, contrast, and make it harmonize, and also contrast at the same time in such a profound and such a moving way that, and it made total sense how you and the rest of the jury awarded the best concerto to him, because, yeah, I sat there and I'm just like, oh my goodness, I got to wipe my tears away. I'm going to be stepping on the stage after him to announce the end of the competition. Like I can't be went up there with tears in my eyes. It's like,
it's an awfully good sign, if it brings tears to your eyes. That's a good, really good thing. Really good.
Yeah. And
no, it was excellent. And the other thing is with Chopin, things have to sound as if you just thought them up at that moment, your particular shaping or your phrasing. They have to sound so natural. They cannot sound calculated, or, I'm going to take a little time on this note and then I'm not going to, that sort of thing just drives me crazy. And so, his performance was very natural, very fluent, very, very moving. Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And for competitions, and this is also more for the audience as well, but given that this is an International Chopin Competition year, and of course I would highly, highly encourage everybody in the audience to watch and listen to the competition, which is taking place in the entirety of the month of October, they're going to be hearing the same pieces or similar pieces played over and over and over again. What is the best approach for them to listen to all these things? How should they watch the competition?
Yeah. Whoa. That's a tough question. Well, I was going to say, when you first asked that question, I was going to say I recommend people not using video, just listening, because video can be very distracting, very distracting. On the other hand, when we go to a concert, we see the person, so you can't really eliminate that particular aspect of it. I like pianists who are quite still when they perform, quite still, because then they don't get in the way of the music. Now, not tense still, but just still, sort of like a calm inner way, which was it Athena? Is that her name?
Yeah, Athena.
She had that. She had that stillness, which I really liked a lot in her playing. And I feel that sort of then we're listening to the music. We're not listening to her. And that, for me, that's really important. Just for the general listener, I don't know. check out the shoes. No, I'm just kidding. um, maybe during the performance, close your eyes just for a few moments and see how the music affects you without looking. I think that can help. But it's all very inspiring because, as I say, the level of playing is so high. I don't know. It's all very, it's overwhelming these days. Overwhelming.
Yeah, yeah. It's like you said earlier, the talent of each and every year, honestly, the talent of every performer who goes up on that stage, especially going to the semis or to the finals, is so high that being able to tell apart the differences, if you don't have any musical training at all or any kind of familiarity with the music,
it's very
it's
hard.
going to be, yeah, exactly. It's going to be so difficult.
I think that's okay. I mean, if you don't have any musical training, you're just listening to it for the beauty of the of the works, and maybe don't listen to it 8 hours a day for an entire month. Maybe you go crazy with that. I was just going to say that one of the experiences I had recently was I was one of the preliminary jurors for the big Cliburn competition. There were 3 of us, and we each had to listen to 113 videos of about 40 minutes each. If you don't think that was exhausting. And that was right after I listened to all the ones for the Chopin competition, Canadian. Anyway, but I think it's interesting to mention that of those 113, I would say there were about 4 who I'd like to hear again. And I'm not saying because they weren't fantastic. They were fantastic, but only about 4 sort of reached me in a way that I think, oh, now that I would really I would go and hear that person. There you go.
Right.
Tricky.
Yeah, it is. And I think, I'm glad you mentioned that you don't need to have musical training to understand or to enjoy the competition.
Right.
Right. Of course it would help, but if it don't have, it doesn't mean if you don't have it, it doesn't mean that you would not enjoy it at all. I mean, there's plenty of people who have never even touched a piano before, but who are very touched by the music. And that's the thing that I think in Canada in particular, there's a misconception of elitism that exists within classical music. And you've certainly seen it. I've seen it. It's that, I have to, the first thing that a lot of people in Canada realize that they think or they misconceive is that, oh, I have to wear a suit to this event. Oh, this is going to be some very, elitist kind of, that kind of event. Or number 2, this music is like, oh, it's so quote unquote boring, right? It's not like your, 4-chord progression, 4/4 time chordal, that sort of music. But I think that, with these misconceptions, though, I think they're starting to improve in Canada. YouTube is actually a great resource, not just in terms of hearing recordings, but even just hearing classical music content creators, younger ones, those are my age and a bit younger, who actually go out of their way to actually explain it in a very fun way, sometimes a bit childish, but in a very fun way that I think has had a pretty substantial effect on not just Canada and the US, but even much of the Western world as a whole.
I think that's probably true. I do think that there's still not enough young kids who are taking music, attending live concerts. They listen to lots and lots of YouTube and blah, 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 blah. But going to a live concert and actually sitting quite close to the person, that's an experience you cannot replicate on YouTube. I'm sorry, you just can't. And I remember I play and coach chamber music at a fantastic chamber music camp in Maine, the state of Maine, every summer. And when my daughter was about 9, I think, my husband brought her with 2 daughters. One was 9, one was 12 or something like that. My husband brought them for a week just to be there. And they went to some of the young people concerts that were there, the people that we coach, and they had no music in their, not really in their lives. They were just gobsmacked. They just couldn't believe it. And that sort of experience, I think, goes a huge distance in getting young people to understand classical music, because it's happening right in front of their face. I think it's important, really important.
Yes.
My parents used to bring us to symphony concerts, and I mean, I was 8 or something, and I loved it. I loved going and hearing that music and sitting in the audience and watching them play. Listening to a record was nothing like that. Didn't even come close.
Yeah. And
anyway,
I have
another rant.
Yeah. No, and I have personal anecdotes too that in my experience, and also more importantly from my friends' experience as well. One of my good friends, very, very good friends, he's actually one of the reasons why I ended up going to sports announcing eventually, and because he himself is a sports announcer, no musical training, at least from what I know so far. But recently, as in last year or the year before, he works for a golf/country club in Toronto. And Eric Guo was actually the performer, one of the performers who come in, because they regularly have performances from the TSO or from other local Toronto classical music groups. And when he heard Eric, and this was the first time he actually had a full-on piano performance, and he was telling me, he's like, man, Amos, Eric is just, oh man, something else, man.
Oh yeah, isn't that wonderful?
And I'm hearing him, it's like, yeah, and like, I told him, first of all, I'm like, welcome to my world, first of all, and second of all, this is why, it hits you a certain way. And it's, I would even say it's even better for him, because it wasn't like he was in just this big concert hall and he was sitting far away from the audience.
Right.
Although that's pretty good too.
Yeah.
He was in a country club.
Not quite the same though. Not quite the same.
Not quite the same, yeah. But he's in a much more intimate setting, a much closer setting, with maybe around 30, 40, or 50 club members.
Yep.
There's the piano and there's him, and he's like, wow. And he also heard Jonathan Crowe in the TSO perform as well, and actually did a conversation interview with him in the past too, and he said the same thing. He's like, oh man, I've been missing out for all these years.
There you go. My point.
Yeah.
And as I say, in an intimate setting is important. I mean, it's one thing to go to an orchestra concert and have a great big sound and everything, but for, chamber music or just piano or even vocal, if you're right there in a smallish room, you're part of it. You're not just sitting there watching something that's way far away. You're part of the experience. That's important.
Yeah. And that's also one thing as well. A lot of, especially young Canadians, because they're so used to hearing pop music, then maybe they've gone to a number of big pop concerts or rock concerts or whatnot. The etiquette there is very different in the sense that you can be actively jumping, screaming, cheering, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But when you're telling them to do the complete opposite in classical music concerts, not all, but for many concerts, it's still sit down, be quiet, and pay attention to the music. For them, and to be fair, due to their age, they're not used to that. So they think it's like, oh, it's boring because I literally can't even move,
Right.
But that's why I think, I think that the school system, to a certain extent, has to have at least some better exposure or immersion into this. It doesn't help that in Ontario recently, apparently, some school boards have actually cut a huge chunk of their music education spending, to the extent where apparently, and this is what I'm hearing from some students, their teachers are teaching music on carts, and it's their homeroom teacher. It's like, wait, what?
Oh my gosh.
It's strange. I mean, this was a recent thing in here in Ontario for the last, I want to say 7 or 8 years, but I'm sitting here thinking, I'm just shaking my head. I'm thinking, how on earth? I mean, would you teach English on a cart? No, it wouldn't make sense. Would you teach math on a cart? No. Would you get your homeroom teacher who's not trained in math to teach math? No. I mean, you can't study advanced functions or calculus like that. No. So why study music like that, right? But I think it's different priorities for a lot of Canadians.
Yeah. It's a shame. It's a shame because if you don't really instill a love of this stuff early on, it's hard to move on, you know?
Yeah.
I think it's important that even if a kid never does anything musically, just to have that exposure.
Yeah.
That's art, you know?
Exactly. It's the human experience, I want to say.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think that's also one issue that I think classical music faces is that young Canadians and really many, even some older Canadians, don't necessarily relate to it because, I mean, first of all, it has to do with history. And unfortunately, in Canada and even parts of the US, history is stereotypically viewed as that boring course in school. It's like, oh, I have to go to history class, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And second of all, because they can't relate to it, it's like, well, why do I have to care about this one, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the, yeah.
That's true. I mean, kids say that about everything now.
Yeah.
Like, why do I need math? Because I'm never going to use math. But
yeah. And I think that maybe it wouldn't necessarily work for kids, but it would probably work for people my age, like, or older, grown adults, basically, or even young adults, where if we try to relate to them, if we try to make the music relate to them, and I think that would work. And the way how I'll explain is this. So when I was volunteering and playing out the Canadian Chopin competition with the rest of the committee, one of the approaches that I had talking with other people outside who have no interest, or I should say no interest, no exposure to this type of music, I would actually first ask them, have you ever gone through any tribulation in your life? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, everybody goes through trials in their life. Okay, how do you overcome that? And they say it. And then I say, well, what if I told you that there's a composer out there who embodies that? Despite everything that's happened in his own life, he still goes through it with a smile. That composer is Chopin. And guess what? There's a competition that will showcase the very best aspects of how he conquered the trials through his music. And guess what? These aren't 50 or 60-year-olds performing. These are youngsters and young adults, in the prime of their life, playing that. Why don't you come and watch?
Yeah, great.
It usually works.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I like that.
Yeah. So at least that's the way how I'm approaching it. But
yeah, I like it.
But yeah. And as we start to close this episode, my last couple of questions are, what are the most rewarding things about your career that you found? What are the most important lessons that you've learned in your career? And what's your advice to those who want to pursue a career in classical music, especially in piano?
Well, I'll start with that one, that last question. My advice for wanting to pursue a career in music is not to think of a career in music, but just wanting to pursue music, because there are no guarantees in this business. Absolutely no guarantees. As I said earlier in this session, there are a lot of people who deserve to have a career but don't, because it just hasn't worked out for various reasons. I mean, and it can be anything. It can be just timing or who they came in contact with, or just anything. So what you need to do is to pursue music because you love it, And you have to be prepared to sacrifice quite a bit for music's sake. I mean, you have to be prepared to take on maybe a day job. I would tell lots of my students, look, if you're not willing to sell shoes so that you can support your music habit, then you should not bother doing it at all. I mean, you should certainly just think of it as a hobby, and that's it. But I mean, the people who really are serious musicians, they put everything else aside for those formative years, and you have to sacrifice a lot. I mean, you can't have a normal life and be a working musician. You can't have a nice life where you go to a baseball game or you watch 3 movies a week, or you have to be prepared to spend the time on this in this area and just pursue it as best you can. Try to meet people that you think are going to inspire you, not are going to help you, but are going to inspire you. And there are lots of summer programs and master classes you can go and listen to or try to take part in. As I say, I think going to concerts is extremely important at the young age. Now, what was the first question you asked me? What have I learned from my career?
Yeah, the most rewarding things and the most important lessons.
Right. Okay. Right. Good. Rewarding things are probably when I myself feel everything has lined up, the stars have lined up, and I've been able to do what I want to do in a performance. When things have just gone along exactly the way I wanted them to do, and I could feel that. That doesn't happen every performance by any means, but from once in a while, it just does, and you come away from thinking, that's what I do. I couldn't have done that better. Maybe somebody else might, but not me. That's one of the most wonderful things that happens from time to time. And the other is reactions from people. If I have somebody come up to me and say, I've had a terrible 2 years of my life, and they'll usually tell me about it, but tonight I feel it's just disappeared. And then I think, well, what else can you ask for? So those are my sort of two-pronged answer to that question. What I've learned is that you can't always be perfect. You can't. We're human. Prepare as well as you can. Go out there and do your very, very best to try to give people something to think about, something to feel. And if some little thing doesn't go your way, it's very easy to focus on that one little thing. You just got to let it go and move on, as they say, move on. And I think I've learned quite a lot on that front. Not that I've ever made a mistake, of course.
Well, great advice to end on, Jane. Jane, thank you so very much for coming on to the podcast on such a very, very busy schedule as well.
Oh, you're welcome, Amos. So it was fun to talk to you. You had some really good thoughts and questions.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I think the audience will very much learn a lot from your career, from the lessons and from the musical thoughts that you've shared today. And, well, to experience very much the living legend of Jane Coop.
Well, thank you, Amos. Appreciate it.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in to this episode of This is the Legend of the Road to Warsaw. This has been the legend of Jane Coop, a longtime legendary pianist and also a jury member as well of many major competitions, including the Junior Van Cliburn and the Canadian Chopin Competition. You can follow her on her website, www.janecoop.com. I'll leave links to that and also other places as well in the description of the video and also the description of the audio podcast. Subscribe to the channel and to click the bell notification icon. Also, sforzando the like button in the process as well, so you'll be sure to have the notifications to every single episode whenever we upload. Once again, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. This is Amos Vang signing off for now. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.